Emily Hart never expected danger to find her inside a hospital room, but it arrived the moment her husband's mistress walked through the door. In seconds, insults turned into violence, and a single strike put both Emily and her unborn child at risk. What followed inside St. Grace Medical Center would unravel secrets, expose betrayal, and ignite a chain of consequences no one could escape. Emily Hart had always imagined that pregnancy would feel like a slow, gentle unfolding, a period marked by careful attention, cautious joy, and the kind of quiet routines that made a woman feel grounded. Instead, she found herself in the maternity wing of St. Grace Medical Center earlier than expected, admitted for monitoring after several days of unusual stress and recurring dizziness. The doctors assured her that precaution was better than regret, and although she hated the idea of staying overnight, she accepted their recommendation. Her baby's heartbeat, displayed in soft waves on the monitor beside her bed, was far too important to gamble with. The room she was assigned to sat near the end of the hallway on the 3rd floor, painted in calming neutral tones and illuminated by steady ceiling lights. The scent of antiseptic lingered, faint but unmistakable, and the soft beeping of the fetal monitor became a kind of background rhythm that she unconsciously matched her breathing to. The hospital bed wasn't comfortable, but Emily had endured worse. What mattered was keeping the baby safe long enough to carry to term. She rested one hand over her belly, feeling the subtle pressure beneath her skin, a reminder that she wasn't alone. Even in moments when her thoughts wandered into darker corners, Jonathan was nowhere to be seen. Her husband had been distant for months, first in small, dismissive ways, then in increasingly obvious shifts of habit and tone. He no longer asked about her prenatal appointments. He no longer came home on time. He no longer touched her the way a husband should touch a wife carrying their child. Emily tried not to dwell on it, but truth had a way of revealing itself slowly, like a bruise that darkened across days until it could no longer be ignored. The night before her hospital admission, she had confronted him about the late nights and unread messages. Jonathan brushed her off with the kind of casual sharpness that felt more painful than yelling. He didn't deny anything, he simply refused to care. His coldness weighed heavily on her, tightening her chest in ways that kept her awake long after midnight. She wondered how a marriage built on stability could shift so quickly into something fragile and unfamiliar. Sometimes she tried to convince herself she was imagining it, that hormones were exaggerating her fears. But deep down, her instincts whispered the truth she didn't want to face. Something in her life had cracked, and she didn't yet know how to repair it. The nurses were kind, offering warm blankets, checking her vitals, and asking if she needed anything. They treated her not as a burden, but as someone deserving of care. Their attention softened the worry that had been building inside her. Still, as she lay in the dimmed room in the late afternoon, she felt the weight of the unknown pressing on her. She wished Jonathan would show up, sit beside her, ask how she felt, demonstrate even a fraction of the concern she had once believed he possessed. Her phone remained untouched on the bedside table. No calls, no messages, no acknowledgement that she was spending the night in a hospital carrying his child. She tried to swallow the sting of it, reminding herself that stress wasn't good for the baby. She closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, and exhaled as slowly as she could manage. Maybe he would come later. Maybe he was on his way now. The thought gave her a thin strand of hope to hold on to. Outside the room, the corridor buzzed with the distant sounds of rolling carts, muffled conversations, and hurried footsteps. Nurses switched shifts. Doctors reviewed charts. Families visited loved ones. The hospital moved around her with a predictable rhythm that made her feel both safe and strangely removed from the world outside its walls. Emily shifted slightly on the bed, adjusting the thin hospital blanket. She wished she had brought her own pillow from home. The hospital one was too stiff. Her back ached from the strange angles she had slept in over the previous nights, and she pressed a hand against her lower spine, trying to ease the discomfort. The baby responded with a small movement, as if sensing her unease. Emily whispered a soft reassurance, rubbing gentle circles on her belly. She didn't know who else she could confide in, and the baby became a quiet anchor, something innocent and unbroken in a life that felt increasingly unstable. Her doctor, Dr. Samuel Rivers, had been straightforward about the risks of stress in pregnancy. "Your vitals aren't alarming," he told her earlier, but your body is sending signals that it needs rest, stability, and reduced emotional strain. Stability. The word clung to her thoughts long after he left the room. How was she supposed to find stability when the person who promised to love her through every challenge seemed to be living a separate life? She wondered if Jonathan would ever ask about the doctor's concerns, or if he'd treat it as just another inconvenience he didn't want to deal with. The memory of the empty passenger seat next to her in the car that morning replayed vividly. She arrived at the hospital alone. She signed in alone. She answered questions alone. And though the medical staff filled some of the silence, she felt the isolation deepening with every passing hour. Emily turned her attention to the small window across the room. The sky outside was a muted gray, the kind of Seattle afternoon that hinted at rain without fully committing to it. Cars moved along the street below, people crossing, living their lives with purpose and direction. She remembered what it felt like to walk freely, to feel the cool breeze on her face without the weight of uncertainty pressing on her chest. Pregnancy had made her slower, more cautious. Emotional turmoil had made her more fragile. She wanted to believe she was stronger than her circumstances, that she could push past the doubt and fear. But her body reminded her daily that she was more vulnerable than ever. She tried again to distract herself, scrolling through old photos on her phone, looking at images of happier times with Jonathan. Vacations, anniversaries, smiles that felt real. Then she traced her finger over the screen, feeling something inside her twist painfully. When had he stopped holding her hand the way he used to? When had his smile become something she no longer recognized? The questions gnawed at her, but she forced herself to put the phone down before the ache in her chest grew sharper. She needed to focus on the present, on the health of her baby, not on the unraveling pieces of her marriage. As evening approached, a nurse checked on her again and adjusted the monitor near her belly. Emily watched the display with steady concentration, focusing on the rhythmic peaks that represented her baby's heartbeat. Strong, steady, alive. The sight brought her brief comfort, enough to pull her away from spiraling thoughts. She whispered another promise to her unborn child, telling them she would do everything she could to protect them, even if it meant facing the future with uncertainty. She wasn't sure how she would manage it, but she knew she had no other choice. Emily shifted her pillow again and settled deeper into the mattress. She had no idea that within the next hour, the hospital room she thought was a place of safety would shatter into chaos. And the truth she feared most about Jonathan would arrive not through words, but through the door that was about to open. The door to Emily Hart's room opened without warning, the metal handle turning with a deliberate slowness that made her instinctively shift her gaze toward it. She expected a nurse or maybe Drita Rivers checking in again, someone whose presence would ease her thoughts for a moment. Instead, she saw a familiar silhouette in an expensively tailored jacket. Jonathan Rees, her husband. For a brief second, a fragile strand of hope stirred in her chest, the kind that whispered he had finally come to see if she was all right. But that hope broke almost instantly when another figure stepped in behind him. Sabrina Lane, the woman who had been haunting Emily's suspicions. The name that had come up in half-finished rumors and late-night whispers Jonathan never bothered to deny. Seeing them arrive together, entering her hospital room as if they belonged there, struck Emily harder than any physical pain she had endured in the past week. Sabrina moved first, gliding forward on heels that clicked sharply against the hospital floor. She wore a fitted black dress that contrasted with the pale blue medical equipment around her, as though she deliberately wanted to stand out in the sterile environment. Her confidence radiated from every movement, casual but calculated, like she had rehearsed the moment she would step into the life of the woman she had helped destroy. She didn't look around the room with curiosity. She assessed it with judgment, as if offended that the world had dared to place her in surroundings she found beneath her. It was the kind of arrogance that didn't come from wealth alone, it came from the belief that she had already won. Jonathan remained near the doorway for a moment, not moving closer, not greeting Emily, not offering even the bare minimum of acknowledgement a husband should give the woman carrying his child. His expression wasn't warm or conflicted. It was blank in a way that felt intentional, like he didn't want to give her the satisfaction of knowing she still mattered. For a man who once traced circles on her stomach every night, whispering about baby names and future plans, this version of him was unrecognizable. Emily stared at him, searching for something: remorse, discomfort, hesitation, but found nothing. Sabrina was the one who broke the tension first. She crossed her arms and tilted her head, offering Emily a smile that was sharp at the edges. "Well," she said, her tone dripping with false sympathy, "I heard you were having a rough day, so I thought we should drop by." The way she emphasized "we" felt like a blade pressed against Emily's ribs. Jonathan didn't correct her. He didn't distance himself. He simply allowed the words to hang in the air, confirming everything Emily had feared but tried to deny for months. Emily pushed herself up slightly on the bed, wincing as the fetal monitor tugged against her skin. She didn't want Sabrina to see the vulnerability in her, but the pain and exhaustion twisted through her muscles, making it impossible to hide completely. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice steady enough to mask the shaking in her chest. She wasn't angry yet. She was confused. A part of her still hoped there was some explanation, something that made sense. But Sabrina's eyes told her otherwise. "Oh, come on, Emily," Sabrina replied, strolling closer to the bed. "You can drop the innocent act. Jonathan told me everything. UV made his life miserable for months. Always sick, always complaining, always needing something." She flicked her gaze toward Jonathan, seeking approval, and he gave her the smallest nod. That single gesture carved a deep, burning ache inside Emily. He agreed. He agreed with the woman who helped destroy their marriage. He agreed that she, the pregnant wife fighting for her health, was a burden. Emily's breath tightened, and she felt the faint pressure of the baby shifting inside her. She instinctively placed a hand on her stomach, a protective reaction that Sabrina noticed instantly. The mistress's eyes narrowed, her expression shifting from smugness to something sharper, more dangerous. "You know," Sabrina said softly, stepping closer than she had any right to, "some women really shouldn't be mothers." The words were whispered with venom, the kind meant to break a person from the inside. Jonathan looked down at his phone, as though bored by the unfolding cruelty. He didn't defend Emily. He didn't defend the child she was carrying. He didn't even flinch. Emily felt her throat tighten, her voice trembling only slightly as she tried to form a response. "You need to leave," she said carefully. "Both of you. This is a hospital. I don't want drama here." But Sabrina let out a low laugh, completely unbothered by the request. "Drama, sweetheart, this isn't drama. This is honesty, something you've been avoiding for a long time." Sabrina's words cut deeper with every sentence. She leaned forward, placing one manicured hand on the metal bar of the hospital bed. "Jonathan doesn't want this life anymore. You've trapped him with your little problems, and now with this baby." Emily tensed, unable to stop the instinctive tightening in her chest. She moved her hand protectively over her belly again, and the action only seemed to provoke Sabrina further. The mistress exhaled sharply, frustration flashing across her face. "Oh, stop pretending you're fragile. It's pathetic." Emily tried to sit up straighter, pushing past her exhaustion. "I want you out," she repeated. But Sabrina was already stepping closer, close enough that Emily could smell the perfume on her skin, a floral scent that didn't belong anywhere near a maternity ward. The tension in the room thickened, turning the air heavy. Then Sabrina's expression shifted slowly, almost imperceptibly, into something reckless. Without warning, she lifted her hand and struck Emily across the face with a sharp, open-handed slap. The sound cracked through the room like a spark igniting dry wood. Emily's head snapped to the side, pain exploding across her cheek as the fetal monitor's steady beeping jumped into rapid alarm. Her vision blurred, and she tasted blood at the corner of her mouth. Her heart thundered inside her chest, and fear clawed its way up her throat. In the corner of her eye, she saw Jonathan, but he didn't move toward her. He didn't shout. He didn't grab Sabrina's arm to stop her. Instead, he stood with a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, as if he had been waiting for this moment to unfold exactly as it did. Emily forced air into her lungs, her hand trembling as she held her stomach. Her body felt like it was unraveling, the sudden shock hitting her harder than she expected. She tried to speak, but her voice was strangled by a rising panic. Sabrina stepped back slightly, chest heaving as if surprised by her own outburst, yet not enough to regret it. The monitor beside Emily screamed with increasing urgency. Footsteps thundered down the hallway. Jonathan straightened his suit jacket, but he still didn't approach her. Sabrina looked toward the door briefly, annoyed rather than concerned. Emily's vision began to swim, her pulse racing out of control. She focused on the one thing that mattered, the faint movement inside her belly. Her baby. She needed help. She needed someone who cared enough to protect her. But the only people in the room were the ones who came to hurt her. And the door was only seconds away from bursting open. The fetal monitor's alarm blared through the room, its rapid beeping slicing through the air with enough force to jolt anyone into action. Emily's breath hitched, her chest tightening as the sound grew louder and more urgent. She tried to steady her heartbeat, but her body refused to cooperate, trembling from the slap and the shock that followed. Her stomach knotted in fear, and she instinctively clutched her belly as if she could shield her unborn child from the chaos surrounding her. The burning pain on her cheek felt secondary to the sharp H rising through her abdomen, an H that made her pulse spike even further. Just outside the door, Nurse Karen Mitchell was updating a chart when the monitor's alarm echoed down the hallway. She recognized the sound instantly. It wasn't just a notification. It was a distress signal. It meant something was wrong, very wrong, with either the mother, the baby, or both. With years of training and instinct guiding her, Karen dropped the pen and moved swiftly toward Emily's room. Her steps quick and precise as she approached the source of the emergency. The moment she pushed open the door, the scene hit her like a shock wave. Emily was half upright on the bed, breathing unevenly, her cheek reddened with a clear mark of force. Blood traced a thin line from the corner of her mouth. Her hand was trembling over her belly, desperately protective. The monitor beside her was flashing with irregular spikes, the baby's heart rate escalating in a pattern that signaled distress. Jonathan stood several feet away, arms crossed, posture rigid, while Sabrina hovered near the bedside with a stiff expression that suggested she was trying to appear innocent, but had no idea how to hide the raw tension still vibrating through her body. Karen didn't waste time questioning what she was seeing. Her medical instincts overrode everything else. She rushed to Emily's side, her voice firm and focused as she assessed the situation. "Emily, look at me," she instructed, checking her vitals with quick efficiency. "Keep your breathing steady. Slow breaths in. Slow breaths out." She placed 2 fingers on Emily's pulse and felt it racing beneath the skin. Her gaze shifted to the monitor, studying the baby's heart rate. The fluctuations were sharp and erratic, proof that something had triggered an intense physical response. She needed to stabilize both mother and child before the situation escalated into a medical crisis. Without looking at Jonathan or Sabrina, Karen pressed the emergency call button on the wall. The alert pinged across the maternity unit, signaling additional medical staff to assist. The air in the room grew tense and electric, every second stretching into something heavier and more urgent. Karen began checking Emily's abdomen with practiced hands, her voice guiding her patient through controlled breathing. Emily tried to follow along, but her body was shaking too hard, each inhale catching against a rising wave of fear. As Karen worked, her attention flicked briefly to the 2 intruders. "What happened in here?" she demanded, her tone cold, authoritative, and leaving no room for evasion. Sabrina stiffened, adjusting her posture, but before she could open her mouth, Jonathan cut in with a dismissive shrug. "Nothing serious. She's overreacting." His voice carried that casual arrogance that suggested he believed he could control the narrative with ease. Karen's eyes narrowed and her jaw tightened. She wasn't naive. She had been in enough emergency situations to recognize the signs of assault, the fresh marks, the emotional shock, the defensive posture, and the violent disruption in vital signs. She didn't need a confession to know something was deeply wrong. "Both of you need to step away from the bed," she ordered, her tone leaving no space for argument. Sabrina bristled, scoffing under her breath, "We not going anywhere." But Karen didn't even turn her head. "Step back." The command came out sharper this time, backed by both authority and unmistakable intent. If Sabrina didn't comply, Karen was prepared to call hospital security immediately. Before Sabrina could respond with another sarcastic remark, 2 additional nurses rushed into the room, alerted by the emergency signal. Their arrival shifted the balance instantly. The medical staff surrounded the bed, focusing solely on Emily's condition. One nurse checked the IV line while another prepared oxygen support in case Emily's breathing worsened. The combined presence of trained professionals made Jonathan and Sabrina seem small, out of place, and undeniably guilty. Karen reached for the fetal monitor strips, reading the printed chart rapidly. Her stress response is too high, she said to the other nurses. We need to lower her heart rate before we risk compromising the baby. She placed a hand on Emily's shoulder, grounding her. You are going to be okay, just stay with me. Focus right here. Emily tried to nod, but the world felt unsteady around her. Her eyes burned. The pain on her cheek pulsed with each beat of her heart. She felt as if her body were betraying her. It hurts, she whispered, trying to steady her voice. Something's wrong. I know, Karen said gently. We were taking care of it. You are not alone. She turned to one of the nurses. Get Drea. Rivers in here now. One of the staff members jogged out of the room. Another adjusted the monitor settings to get a clearer reading. The atmosphere was thick with professional urgency, the kind that came when moments mattered and mistakes weren't an option. But through it all, Sabrina stood frozen near the corner of the room, arms wrapped around herself, looking both defensive and irritated, as if she couldn't believe this was happening in front of medical staff who refused to be manipulated. Jonathan shifted his weight, tapping his foot impatiently. She's being dramatic, he muttered under his breath. She does this all the time. Karen turned her head sharply, her eyes locking onto him with a glare that could cut steel. A pregnant woman does not do this all the time, unless something is seriously wrong, she snapped. And given the state she's in, your behavior is not helping. Jonathan opened his mouth as if to argue, but Karen held up a hand. Do not speak. You are not my priority here. She is. The other nurses exchanged glances, recognizing the tension but staying focused on their tasks. Moments later, Dr. Samuel Riz rushed inside, pulling on gloves as he approached the bed. He immediately examined Emily, his expression tightening as he saw the swelling forming along her cheekbone and the erratic spikes on the monitor. What happened? He demanded, voice taut with controlled urgency. Karen answered without hesitation. Patient suffered blunt impact trauma to the face. Stress levels spiked, baby's heart rate unstable. Dr. Rivers nodded, already assessing Emily's abdomen and her breathing pattern. Emily, stay with me, he said, his tone both firm and reassuring. We're going to bring everything under control. He ordered a series of checks, and the nurses moved quickly to follow them. As the medical team worked, Karen stepped away for just long enough to pick up the tablet mounted near the wall. With swift, precise movements, she began documenting what she had walked in on: condition of the patient, visible injury, statements made, presence of others in the room, and the exact time the emergency was triggered. Every detail mattered, every detail would be recorded, and every detail would be used. She didn't look at Jonathan or Sabrina when she wrote, but she didn't need to. She felt their growing discomfort, especially as they realized the staff was no longer treating this as a minor commotion but as a serious medical and potentially legal incident. Karen's documentation would become part of the hospital record, a record that could be accessed by security, law enforcement, or attorneys. When she finished entering the notes, Karen stepped closer to the couple. Her voice no longer merely firm, it carried the weight of someone who was done tolerating disrespect. You two need to leave this room now, she said. The patient requires immediate medical care, and you are interfering. Sabrina's lips parted as if she wanted to argue, but Jonathan grabbed her wrist, and they both hesitated. For the first time since they arrived, uncertainty flickered across their faces. They weren't in control of this environment. The hospital was. Karen didn't wait for their response. She turned back to Emily, her expression softening as she approached the bedside again. You're safe now, she said in a low, steady voice. We've got you. Just keep breathing with us. Emily exhaled shakily, closing her eyes as the team continued their work. The pain was still there, the fear still raw, but for the first time since the slap landed, she felt something else beneath the chaos: protection. Someone was fighting for her, and for the tiny life inside her. The room continued buzzing with medical movement, but Emily held onto Karen's words like a lifeline. Because even though nothing outside the hospital room had changed yet, something inside it finally had. The medical team worked in a coordinated rush as Emily's condition fluctuated. After a few tense minutes of stabilizing her breathing and monitoring the baby's heart rate, Rivers made the call to transfer her to the special observation unit on the same floor. It was a section reserved for high-risk pregnancies, trauma cases, and situations where mother and child required constant supervision. The decision wasn't made lightly. It meant Emily's situation had crossed from concern into active risk, and no one in the room doubted the seriousness of what had just happened. The nurses adjusted her IV lines, secured the fetal monitor straps, and prepared her bed for transport. Though her cheek throbbed with pain and her pulse still raced, Emily clung to the hope that moving her would bring some degree of safety and stability. She could feel a faint tightening in her abdomen, a stress response. The doctor explained, but even knowing that didn't make the sensation any less terrifying. As they rolled her bed out of the room, Emily stared at the ceiling, watching the fluorescent lights pass overhead in slow, fractured intervals. Everything felt distant yet overwhelming: the odor of disinfectant, the soft chatter of staff coordinating her transfer, the wheels of the bed gliding across the polished floor. The corridor felt longer than she remembered, stretching endlessly while her thoughts twisted with fear for her baby. Rivers walked alongside her, maintaining a steady pace. He checked her monitor periodically and reassured her that the baby was still fighting strong. His calm tone anchored her, giving her something concrete to focus on besides the pain radiating from the side of her face. Nurse Karen followed just behind, holding the chart she had started documenting earlier. Her expression was tight with a mixture of determination and concern. She had seen traumatic cases before, but something about this one made her chest tighten. Maybe it was the sight of a pregnant woman hurt inside a place meant for healing. Maybe it was the cold indifference she had witnessed from Jonathan. Or maybe it was the fact that Emily had clearly endured more than she had admitted. When they reached the special observation unit, the double doors opened automatically, and the atmosphere shifted. The lighting was softer here, but the medical presence was stronger: multiple monitors, quietly humming machines, and rooms equipped for rapid intervention. Emily was moved into one of the private monitoring suites, and the team began setting everything up again. They adjusted her bed, reconnected the fetal sensors, and replaced the continuous heart rate printout with a digital monitor that displayed real-time data. The baby's heartbeat echoed rhythmically through the room, strong enough to bring Emily a small wave of relief. Rivers began examining the injury on her cheek, his gloves cool against her skin. He made gentle, precise movements, carefully assessing the swelling and checking for hidden complications. As he worked, his jaw tightened, especially when he noted the fresh red mark that clearly indicated a deliberate strike. The angle, the force, and the pattern made it impossible to interpret as an accident. Emily could sense his disapproval, but also his restraint. He kept his tone professional, though the underlying tension grew with each observation. "You were going to have some swelling for a while," he said quietly as he documented the findings. "I'll order imaging if we suspect a fracture, but for now the priority is keeping your stress levels down and making sure the baby remains stable." Emily nodded, though the simple motion sent a pulse of pain through the left side of her face. She closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing the doctor's words, wishing she could push away the memory of Sabrina's hand striking her. The doctor then turned to Karen. "Document the injury thoroughly," he instructed. "Time of discovery, condition of the patient, fetal response, everything. Include your initial observations when you entered the room." Karen nodded immediately. She had already begun writing, but the doctor's directive confirmed what she already knew: this was no routine incident. This would be treated as trauma until proven otherwise. Once the doctor stepped out to update Emily's medical file, Karen approached the bedside and adjusted the blanket around Emily's legs. She kept her movements steady and careful, her eyes scanning the monitors before returning to Emily's face. "You were safe in this unit," she said softly, her voice carrying reassurance without pity. "You will have nurses checking on you frequently, and no one gets in here without clearance." Emily swallowed hard, her throat tight. She wanted to speak but felt overwhelmed by the weight of everything. Karen didn't push her to talk. Instead, she focused on checking the IV line and making sure Emily was physically stable before moving on to administrative steps. But Emily eventually gathered the courage to ask a question that had been clawing at her. "Is the baby okay?" Her voice cracked on the last word, revealing the fear she had been trying desperately to contain. Karen took a moment to review the updated heart rate readings and then gave a small nod. "The baby's heart rate is leveling out. That's a good sign," she said. "Your body reacted strongly to the stress, but it looks like things are stabilizing. We'll keep a close eye on both of you, Emily exhaled shakily, relief mixing with lingering dread. She felt the weight of exhaustion settle deep into her bones, the emotional strain wearing her down more than the physical injury. Karen made a few additional notes, then turned her attention to the administrative panel just outside the room. She confirmed patient status, filed a trauma alert, and entered a time-stamped statement documenting the disturbance that had triggered the emergency call. In the main hallway, Jeter Rivers met briefly with the charge nurse, outlining Emily's condition and emphasizing the need for continuous observation. His tone was clipped, more serious than usual. He handed over the preliminary medical report, which detailed the nature of the injuries, the fetal distress response, and the initial stabilization steps taken. "This isn't a simple stress reaction," he said. "She experienced physical trauma. We need to document everything clearly. If her condition worsens, or the baby shows repeated stress patterns, we will have to escalate." While the medical team continued working through protocols, Emily lay in her bed, listening to the steady rhythm of the monitor. The room felt safer than before, but safety didn't erase the memory of what had happened. Every time she blinked, she saw Sabrina's hand flying toward her. Every time she inhaled, she felt the phantom sting on her cheek. She wondered how far things would have gone if the nurse hadn't arrived when she did. She wondered how Jonathan could stand there and watch her get hit without lifting a finger. The emotional damage ran deeper than the physical injury. Karen re-entered the room a few minutes later, carrying a new set of forms that required review. She explained what each meant: routine documentation for trauma patients, consent for expanded monitoring, and confirmation of emergency contacts. Emily signed slowly, her hand unsteady, but Karen guided her through each page with patience. When they reached the section about visitor restrictions, Karen paused. "You can request a limited access protocol," she said. "That means certain people can be blocked from entering this unit." Her tone held no assumptions, but the option hovered in the air with unspoken clarity. Emily hesitated. A wave of pain and betrayal surged through her chest when she thought of Jonathan and Sabrina. She wasn't ready to confront the full weight of their actions, but she knew what her instincts were telling her. "Yes," she whispered. "Please add them both." Karen nodded without hesitation, entering their names into the restricted list. It was an administrative action on the surface, but Emily felt something shift inside her, something small but empowering. A boundary had been drawn, a line they could not cross. As the night crew began cycling in and the doctors prepared for regular rounds, Emily remained surrounded by the low hum of machines and the steady presence of medical staff who took her condition seriously. The hospital had become more than a place of care. It had become a buffer between her and the danger she never imagined she would face. Emily wasn't sure what awaited her after discharge, but within these walls, she knew one thing with certainty: the truth of what had happened was finally being acknowledged. The Special Observation Unit had settled into its late evening rhythm, but Nurse Karen Mitchell wasn't slowing down. After ensuring Emily was stable enough to rest, she stepped into the hallway with the hospital tablet tucked under her arm. Her face remained composed, but her mind was racing with the procedural steps that needed to be completed. The incident she walked in on wasn't minor, wasn't ambiguous, and wasn't something she could mention casually in the system. This was a documented assault against a pregnant patient, and protocol demanded thoroughness. Karen moved quickly toward the nurse's station, her shoes tapping steadily against the linoleum floor as she prepared herself for the amount of reporting ahead. She sat down, logged into the hospital system, and opened the critical event documentation portal. The interface automatically time-stamped her entry with the exact minute she began, a feature designed to establish clear chronology. She started typing, choosing each word with exactness. She described Emily's physical condition when she entered the room: the fresh red mark, the swelling, the visible distress, the disrupted breathing pattern, and the dangerously fluctuating fetal heart rate. She entered the medical readings from the initial scan, the stabilizing actions taken, and the names of every attending nurse and physician who responded. Then she moved to the section requiring environmental observations. This was the part the legal team would scrutinize later. She recorded the presence of Jonathan Rees and Sabrina Lane, their proximity to the patient, and the emotional state Karen perceived. She noted that Sabrina appeared agitated, defensive, and physically close enough to have inflicted harm. She added Jonathan's passive stance, his dismissive attitude, and his refusal to follow her first instruction to step back from the bed. She concluded the section with a clear, unembellished statement: patient exhibited signs consistent with acute physical assault. The cursor blinked at the end of the line, and Karen read through the report again. It aligned with her memory perfectly, and she had included every concrete detail. This was the type of report that could open entire investigations, and she knew its accuracy mattered. Next, she accessed the hospital's security system request tab. With a series of clicks, she filed a mandatory footage preservation request. She entered the camera ID numbers for the hallway, the entry point near Emily's room, and the adjoining intersection. The system confirmed each video feed had been flagged for restricted access and automatic preservation. This ensured no footage could be overwritten in the next 30 days. The confirmation message brought Karen a small measure of reassurance. She had learned long ago that video evidence often spelled the difference between accountability and denial. Once she finished the request, Karen stood up from the station and walked to the wall phone mounted beside the medication storage unit. She opened Emily's chart on the tablet and scrolled to the emergency contact section. The name stared back at her in bold text: William Hart. Father, primary emergency contact, authorization full decision making if patient is incapacitated. Karen recognized the last name immediately. Hart was not common in Seattle, and she wondered if he was the same William Hart she'd heard about years earlier, a former defense attorney known for tearing holes through poorly built cases. She didn't know him personally, but she knew enough to expect he wouldn't react mildly to what had happened to his pregnant daughter. She took a breath to steady herself before dialing. The phone rang once, then twice. On the third ring, a deep, controlled voice answered. "This is William Hart." Karen introduced herself, stated the hospital name, and immediately clarified that Emily was not in critical danger but had experienced a medical event requiring emergency response. She didn't give details yet. Protocol required first confirming the identity of the person on the line. William provided the last 4 digits of his ID and Emily's date of birth without hesitation, his voice firm and quick, as though he had been waiting for a call like this. Once identity was verified, Karen explained the situation in direct, professional terms. "Your daughter suffered physical trauma from an altercation inside her room. We have documented the injury, stabilized her, and transferred her to the special observation unit for continuous monitoring. The baby experienced stress but is currently stable." The quiet pause that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy with restrained emotion and an unmistakable shift in tone. William's voice, when it finally came, was low and deliberate. "I'm on my way. Do not allow anyone unauthorized to approach her. Secure all records, all footage, and all notes. Nothing gets amended. Nothing gets lost." Karen assured him the hospital was already following strict protocols. He ended the call with a curt acknowledgement, giving no room for small talk or lingering questions. The moment she hung up the phone, she felt a shift in the air, as if a different kind of storm had been set in motion. Karen walked back toward Emily's room. She paused for a moment before stepping inside, collecting her thoughts. Emily was lying in the hospital bed with her eyes half closed, her breathing steadier, but still tight with fatigue and emotional strain. The fetal heartbeat monitor continued its rhythmic pattern, a sound that brought a sense of grounding to the room. Karen approached quietly and checked the readings once more. Everything remained stable for now. Emily looked at her, confusion and exhaustion mixing in her expression. "Did you call my dad?" she asked, voice soft but strained. Karen nodded. "Yes, he's on his way." He sounded very concerned and very clear about wanting everything preserved and handled properly. Emily swallowed, her throat tight. The idea of her father learning what happened brought both comfort and dread. He was protective, sometimes intensely so, and she feared how he might react to knowing she had been attacked inside a hospital by the woman her husband cheated with. Karen adjusted the blanket around Emily's legs and gently placed a cool compress against her cheek. Emily winced, then relaxed as the relief seeped into the swollen skin. "You did the right thing calling him," Emily murmured. I couldn't have explained it myself right now." "That's why we here," Karen replied. "Your job is to rest. Ours is to handle the rest." She checked the EV line again. Everything was flowing correctly. As Karen documented the latest readings, she made sure to include every change in Emily's vitals, knowing the timeline mattered. If Emily's condition worsened in any way, the report had to show the progression accurately. Outside the room, the hospital continued its steady rhythm, but Karen felt the energy around this case tightening. She could sense an investigation forming long before the detectives arrived. She had seen trauma cases before: accidents, falls, medical complications, but this one carried a different weight. A deliberate act, inside a protected medical environment, against a vulnerable patient. She moved to the doorway, glancing down the hall, where Jonathan and Sabrina had walked away earlier. Neither had attempted to return, and access to the unit was now restricted. They would not get near Emily again without going through hospital security first. Karen closed the door gently and returned to Emily's bedside. "Rest," she said softly. "We be watching over you and your baby. You be safe here." Emily's eyes drifted shut, exhaustion pulling her under, but Karen remained by her side a moment longer. Watching the rhythmic rise and fall of her breathing, everything was documented, everything was preserved, everything was set in motion. And somewhere across the city, a father was racing toward the hospital, ready to do what Emily could not. While the medical staff worked inside the special observation unit, Jonathan Rees and Sabrina Lane walked down the main maternity corridor with the kind of confidence that only came from people who believed consequences were things that happened to other people. Sabrina's heels clicked sharply against the floor with each step, irritation radiating through her posture as she crossed her arms tightly. Jonathan matched her pace, his expression carefully controlled, though a faint tension in his jaw betrayed the fact that he wasn't as comfortable as he pretended to be. They had left Emily's room without a second glance, as if the woman lying injured inside wasn't Jonathan's wife or the mother of his unborn child. To them, the hospital room had merely been an inconvenient stop in the way of their day. Sabrina spoke first, voice low but sharp. "That nurse acted like she had the right to boss us around," she muttered. "She didn't even ask what happened." Jonathan shrugged, giving her a dismissive look. "Nurses always overact. She'll file some report and then it'll get buried like everything else. Hospitals don't want drama." There was confidence in his tone, but also a hint of arrogance he had relied on for years. The idea that anyone would challenge him, let alone document his presence in a highly sensitive situation, didn't even seem to register in his mind. He had built his entire adult life on the assumption that charm and power could smooth over anything. They reached the waiting area, and Sabrina dropped into one of the cushioned chairs with an exaggerated sigh. "I swear, if this becomes an issue, I'm going to lose it. I barely touched her." Jonathan gave her a quick glare. "You shouldn't have touched her at all." Sabrina shot back instantly. "You didn't stop me." For a moment, Jonathan looked like he wanted to correct her, but he didn't. They both knew she was right. He hadn't lifted a finger. Instead, he had watched Emily in distress with an expression that terrified anyone who truly understood the moment. He simply didn't care. Back inside the special observation unit, Nurse Karen Mitchell finished documenting the last portion of her report. She stood from the nurse's station and walked directly to the corridor intersection where Jonathan and Sabrina had last been seen. The hospital cameras positioned at various angles provided full coverage of the hallways, capturing time-coded footage of movements throughout the unit. Hospitals like St. Grace had strict protocols for incidents involving patient harm, especially harm inflicted by visitors. Karen tapped the tablet screen and pulled up the timestamp of the emergency alarm. Then she walked back through the hallway, mentally reconstructing the sequence of events. She replayed everything she saw in her mind: the door opening, Emily's injured face, the rising panic in her breathing, the monitor alarms, Jonathan's indifference, Sabrina's defensive tone. Every detail had burned itself into her memory. The clinical part of her training required her to focus on facts, but the human part of her couldn't ignore the image of Emily clutching her stomach, as if her hands alone could shield her unborn child. Karen approached the security desk stationed near the main entrance of the unit. The security officer looked up, already aware that something unusual had occurred. The emergency call and the subsequent restricted access alert had been enough to draw attention. Karen explained the situation briefly. "Sticking to the most critical points, we need to preserve hallway footage from 15 minutes before the emergency call until 15 minutes after. Camera feeds 3A, 3DB, and 3 should capture the individuals involved." The officer nodded and typed quickly into the system. We'll lock the footage and prevent automatic deletion. You will get a confirmation in your inbox within the next few minutes." While the officer worked, Karen flipped to another tab on her tablet and updated the restricted visitor list. She added Jonathan Rees and Sabrina Lane, entering a note specifying hospital policy regarding patient endangerment. If either of them attempted to re-enter the unit, security would be notified immediately and have authority to remove them. She also included a directive that only medical staff, approved family members, and authorized personnel could access Emily's room until further notice. As she returned toward the special observation unit, Karen noticed two younger nurses whispering near the medication cabinet. They quickly straightened when they saw her approaching. Although they didn't ask her directly, their expressions revealed the questions forming silently what really happened. Is Emily okay? Did those two cause the injury? Karen didn't respond verbally, but the set of her jaw and the firmness in her steps made it clear that the situation was being taken seriously. Back in the waiting area, Jonathan checked his phone again. He scrolled through his messages with irritation, tapping his foot loudly. Sabrina leaned against his shoulder, pouting. "Are we really waiting here? Can't we just leave? The doctors have her now." Jonathan didn't look at her. "We should stay, at least for a little while. It'll look suspicious if we walk out immediately." Sabrina rolled her eyes. "Anyone who knows you would know you don't care about how things look." She wasn't wrong, but Jonathan wasn't ready to admit the truth. He had already crossed a line he couldn't walk back from. The fear hadn't hit him yet, but it was beginning to creep beneath his confidence like a slow leak in a sealed container. As they sat, a few staff members passed by, their eyes flicking briefly toward the pair before quickly looking away. Their neutrality didn't hide the tension. Hospitals were trained environments, and staff members could sense when something wasn't right. Jonathan felt the shift too. The looks weren't accusatory, but they weren't casual either. They were observant, too observant. Meanwhile, Karen returned to Emily's room to check on her again. The doctor had stepped out to review imaging results, and Emily lay with her eyes partially open, breathing more evenly than earlier. Karen adjusted the angle of her bed slightly and rechecked the fetal heart monitor. The baby's heartbeat had stabilized into a steady, reassuring rhythm. That alone eased some of the pressure pressing against Karen's chest. She didn't know Emily well, but the vulnerability she saw earlier stayed with her, pushing her to handle every detail with heightened care. After a few minutes, Karen stepped out and returned once more to the nurse's station. She synced her tablet with the main system and saw the notification she had been waiting for: camera footage preserved, incident time range locked. She tapped the file to verify it. The still images of time-stamped hallway footage loaded onto the screen, showing Jonathan and Sabrina arriving at the unit, entering the hallway, approaching Emily's room, and finally leaving. It was all clearly visible. The exact time they entered, the moment they exited, their movements, their posture, everything. There were no blind spots. The evidence was no longer vulnerable. The hospital had it secured. Karen exhaled, feeling a sense of progress. Every step she had taken, every file, every note, every camera request added a layer of protection around Emily and the unborn child. She knew that sooner or later, someone outside the hospital would come asking questions. And when they did, Karen wanted to be ready. What she didn't know yet was that the person coming for answers would be Emily's father. And he would arrive with a force that stunned even the seasoned staff of Grace Medical Center. For now, though, the hallways continued their steady rhythm, and the hospital system quietly built a case brick by brick, timestamp by timestamp. And far from the special observation unit, Jonathan and Sabrina waited in ignorance. Unaware that the security cameras had already captured everything they hoped would disappear, the steady rhythm of the fetal heart monitor became the only sound Emily focused on as the immediate rush of medical intervention settled. She lay in the special observation unit, the dimmed lights casting soft shadows across the room. Her breathing had steadied, but her body still shook with aftershocks of the trauma. The pain on her cheek throbbed in a slow, pulsing pattern, a physical reminder of what had happened. For a moment, she kept her eyes closed, letting the warm compress Karen had placed over the injury dull the ache. But as the room quieted around her, and the footsteps of the medical staff faded into distant movement, her thoughts drifted back to the part of the ordeal she hadn't had the strength to fully process yet. She opened her eyes, glancing toward the doorway not because she expected to see someone, but because a small, tired part of her hoped she might be wrong about what she remembered. She waited, staring at the open space near the foot of her bed, searching for any sign that Jonathan might walk in, sit beside her, ask if she and the baby were all right. Even a hint of regret would have been something. But the doorway remained empty, and the longer she stared, the more reality pressed down on her. Her husband had left her here, alone, hurt, shaken, pregnant. The realization hit her not as a sharp blow, but as a slow, heavy weight that settled across her chest, difficult to breathe beneath. She replayed the last few minutes before she was moved to the observation unit. Jonathan, standing near the wall with his arms crossed, refusing to move closer, his voice dismissive, his expression detached, and then walking away without offering a glance back at her. He hadn't asked if she needed him. He hadn't demanded answers from the woman who struck his wife. He hadn't even shown basic concern. He had left voluntarily. Emily felt a tightening in her throat, a trembling in her bottom lip she tried to suppress. She didn't want to fall apart. She didn't want the baby to feel the stress that still simmered beneath her ribs. But the emotional blow of what she had witnessed a moment she couldn't unsee hit her harder than the physical slap from Sabrina. She wrapped a hand gently over her stomach, grounding herself in the presence of the life inside her. It was not the baby's fault. None of this was. Nurse Karen entered the room quietly, carrying a small tray with water, gauze, and medical tape. She checked the monitors first, ensuring everything remained stable. When she turned to Emily, she caught the subtle wobble in her patient's expression. She recognized the swelling emotion, the tremor of someone who had been holding herself together for too long. Karen stepped closer to the bedside and spoke in a calm, reassuring tone. "Your vitals are continuing to improve. The baby's readings are looking better too." Emily nodded, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. Karen noticed. She set the tray on the side table and gently adjusted the compress on Emily's cheek. "You redoing everything right?" Karen said softly. "Your body went through a shock. It's going to take some time to settle." Emily swallowed, the movement tight against her dry throat. She didn't know how to put her emotions into words without breaking apart completely. Her voice, when it finally emerged, sounded fragile and strained. "He left." Karen paused, her hand still resting lightly near the compress. "Yes," she answered honestly. There was no point in pretending otherwise. Jonathan and Sabrina had walked away without hesitation. Karen had seen it herself. Emily's breath faltered, and she blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. "He just walked out. He didn't even look at me." Her voice broke slightly, and she dipped her gaze to the blanket, ashamed of how vulnerable she felt. Karen pulled the visitor chair closer to the bed and sat down, maintaining a gentle, steady presence. "What happened in that room wasn't your fault," she said firmly. "And his reaction that says everything about him, not you." Emily covered her face briefly with her free hand, trying to gather herself. She felt raw, exposed, and overwhelmingly drained. "I don't understand how he could watch that happen," she whispered. "How could he stand there and not do anything?" Karen hesitated before responding. She had witnessed many complicated relationship dynamics during her years in nursing. But something about Jonathan's indifference had unsettled her more than usual. "Sometimes people reveal who they truly are when they think they don't have to answer to anyone," she said. "But you are not alone here. We are taking care of you." Emily let out a shaky breath, the words sinking deep. She knew the nurse was trying to comfort her medically and emotionally, but a part of her still felt overwhelmingly hollow. She had walked into the hospital earlier that day thinking she needed treatment for stress or dehydration. She had not imagined she would face the emotional unraveling of her marriage. She had not imagined the father of her child would show such cold detachment in a moment of crisis. Karen continued checking her vitals as she spoke. "Your dad is on his way." He sounded very focused. "He's going to want to talk to you, but we'll make sure it doesn't overwhelm you." Emily nodded again, though worry flickered through her. Her father was fiercely protective. He wouldn't tolerate what had happened, not one bit. And Emily wasn't sure she had the strength to relive the experience through explanations. As the minutes passed, her emotions rose and fell like steady waves, each one pulling her deeper into the complexity of everything that had unraveled. She tried to stay calm for the baby, but couldn't stop the intrusive memory of Sabrina standing over her with that awful, triumphant expression, and Jonathan's smirk that haunted her more than the slap. That smirk told her everything. He had made his choice long before this moment. Karen noticed the way Emily tensed every few seconds. She placed a light, grounding hand on her arm. "Emily, look at me for a moment." Emily lifted her gaze slowly. "Right now you are safe. You and your baby are being monitored closely, and no one who hurt you is getting anywhere near this room again. I need you to focus on your breathing and on the fact that help is coming. We're here with you." Emily held onto those words like a lifeline. The weight in her chest didn't disappear, but it eased slightly, softened by Karen's steady presence. For a long moment, Emily remained still, absorbing the truth of her situation. She wasn't alone. She wasn't unsupported. And although the emotional wounds cut deep, something inside her shifted, a realization. The people who truly cared, her father, the medical team, the child growing inside her, were the ones who mattered now. As Karen adjusted the monitors one more time, Emily stared toward the doorway again. Not to hope Jonathan would return, but to reinforce the fact that she didn't need him to. Because he had shown her, definitively and brutally, the kind of man he truly was. And the emptiness he left behind would not define her future. Everything that mattered now was within these walls: the care, the protection, and the quiet certainty that she and her baby were going to be protected from this point forward. Karen checked her pulse one last time before stepping back. "You're stronger than you think," she said. "Rest while you can. We've got everything else handled." And for the first time since the ordeal began, Emily let her eyes drift shut, not from defeat, but from the knowledge that she didn't have to face the next steps alone. The automatic doors at the entrance of Grace Medical Center slid open with a soft mechanical sweep as William Hart stepped inside. At 62, he carried himself with the sharp composure of a man who had spent decades commanding courtrooms and negotiation tables. His dark charcoal suit was tailored, his shoulders squared, his expression firm enough to make the young receptionist stiffen before he even reached her desk. He didn't rush, but his stride was purposeful, each step weighted with a contained urgency that made it clear he wasn't a man to waste time. When he identified himself, the receptionist quickly pulled up Emily's status. "She's in the Special Observation Unit, Mr. Hart. A nurse is expecting you." William nodded once, thanked her with a brief but courteous tone, and moved toward the elevators. His face remained unreadable, but beneath that controlled exterior, emotions churned: fear for his daughter, anger at the unknown, and an unwavering determination to uncover every detail. The elevator doors closed, and he pressed the button for the third floor with a measured calm. As the elevator ascended, he replayed Nurse Karen's words from the call. Physical trauma, fetal distress, transferred to observation. His jaw tightened. Emily hadn't mentioned any serious issues earlier that week. She had sounded tired but optimistic, talking about baby names and promising to schedule a lunch once she felt better. Nothing in her voice had hinted at danger. Nothing suggested the kind of emergency that prompted a nurse to speak in clipped, urgent tones. When the doors opened, he stepped out into the maternity hallway and immediately spotted Nurse Karen approaching. She recognized him at once: the purposeful walk, the intense gaze, the kind of presence that didn't blend quietly into a crowd. "Mr. Hart?" she asked. "Yes," he answered. "Take me to my daughter." Karen gestured down the hallway and walked beside him. "She's stable for now," she said. "The baby is stable too, but we're keeping her under continuous monitoring. She had a significant stress response." William listened intently, every word processed with the precision of a seasoned legal mind. "And the injury?" he asked. Karen hesitated before responding. "She has visible bruising and swelling on her cheek. The impact was strong enough to trigger her symptoms. She's exhausted and shaken but responsive." William inhaled through his nose, the only outward sign of anger he allowed himself. "Thank you for taking care of her," he said, his tone sincere despite the weight behind it. "I understand an incident occurred inside her room. I want every piece of evidence preserved: footage, medical records, visitor logs, everything. No alterations, no delays." Karen nodded firmly. "We've already begun that process. Security has locked all relevant footage, and your daughter's medical documentation was completed immediately after the event." "Good," he replied. "Very good." His voice remained steady, but his eyes hardened. "No one harms my daughter without facing the consequences." They reached Emily's room, and Karen paused at the door. "She's resting, but she's awake. William placed a hand on the doorframe for a moment, bracing himself before entering. When he stepped inside, the sight of Emily lying on the bed hit him harder than any courtroom blow he had ever endured. His daughter looked small against the medical equipment, tired, fragile, and carrying a bruise that stood out angrily against her pale skin. Her eyes lifted the moment she sensed movement, and when she saw him, her expression softened into something halfway between relief and heartbreak. "Dad," she whispered. William crossed the room in 2 strides and stood beside her, placing a steady hand on her arm. "I'm here," he said quietly, but the strength behind the words filled the room. He examined her face carefully, noting the swelling, the faint cut on her lip, the redness along her cheekbone. His jaw tightened again, but he kept his voice gentle. "How bad does it hurt?" "It's okay now," Emily murmured, though the strain in her expression told him the truth. "They've been taking care of me." He nodded. "Good. They were doing exactly what they should." His eyes drifted to the fetal monitor, its steady rhythm a welcome reassurance. "And the baby?" "Holding steady," Emily said. Her voice wavered slightly. "They said the stress reaction was strong, but the baby's okay now." William exhaled slowly, letting relief settle in his chest for a brief moment before returning to the matter at hand. He moved a chair closer and sat beside her. "Emily," he said, keeping his tone soft, "I need to know what happened." She looked at him, fear flickering across her eyes. "Sabrina came in, with Jonathan." Even saying the name seemed to drain her. "She was angry, she said awful things. And then she hit me." Emily reached for the compress on her cheek, pressing it lightly. Jonathan didn't stop her. William's composure cracked for the briefest moment, a glint of fury sparking in his eyes. But he regained control quickly, smoothing a hand gently over Emily's arm. "You don't have to explain everything right now," he said. "Just rest. I've already begun the process of securing evidence, and the people responsible for this won't escape accountability." Emily swallowed hard. I never imagined he would just stand there." Her voice grew quieter. "I thought he cared about the baby. At least that." William felt a sharp ache in his chest but didn't let it show. "Emily, a man who stands by while his pregnant wife is attacked is not someone capable of caring. That's not a reflection of you. That's a reflection of him. And this ends here." Karen stepped inside briefly to check the monitors, giving father and daughter a respectful amount of space. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, exhaustion pulling at her expression. William stood again, adjusting the blanket around her legs and making sure she was comfortable. He wasn't a sentimental man by nature, but Emily brought out a gentleness in him that few people had ever seen. He brushed a strand of hair away from her forehead. "Rest, I'll be right outside. You're safe now." Emily nodded weakly, letting her eyes drift shut as the weight of fatigue pressed down again. William stepped out of the room and closed the door with deliberate care. Karen was waiting near the nurse's station. He approached her with the controlled precision of a man shifting fully into protective mode. "I need copies of everything as soon as they're available," he said. "And if anyone attempts to access my daughter's room without authorization, notify me immediately." "You will be the first to know," Karen assured him. We were watching her closely. William inclined his head, appreciation flashing briefly in his expression. Then he straightened, turned toward the hallway, and walked toward the waiting area where Jonathan and Sabrina had last been seen. His steps were slow, deliberate, and carrying the weight of a man preparing for confrontation. The storm he brought with him didn't need raised voices or threats. It came through the firm, unbreakable promise in his eyes. No one harmed his daughter without consequences. And the consequences were coming. Jonathan Rees leaned back in the waiting room chair, stretching his legs out as though he were relaxing in a luxury lounge instead of a hospital maternity floor. The overhead lights cast a warm glow across the space, highlighting the sleek furniture and polished floors, but Jonathan barely noticed. His attention flicked between his phone screen and the hallway leading deeper into the special observation unit. Sabrina sat beside him, arms crossed, tapping her manicured fingernails against the armrest in a steady rhythm of irritation. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, glaring at a passing nurse who didn't acknowledge them. "You'd think someone would come out and tell us what's going on by now. It's not like she's dying." Jonathan shrugged without looking up. "Hospitals exaggerate everything. They keep patients overnight for a cough. His tone was dismissive, laced with a kind of arrogance that suggested he believed he was above dealing with medical protocol. Emily's always been dramatic. I'm sure she'll be fine. Sabrina scoffed. She acted like I stabbed her. I barely touched her. She inspected her nails with a smugness that made Jonathan smirk. You know how she is, oversensitive, emotional. Pregnancy just made it worse. Jonathan locked his phone and sat up straighter, lowering his voice slightly. The nurse was out of line, giving us orders, acting like she runs the place. Sabrina nodded vigorously. Exactly! And the way she glared at me like I'm the problem. Emily was the one who started it. She provoked me. Jonathan reached over and gently squeezed her knee. It doesn't matter. No one's going to make a big deal out of this. The hospital staff has to pretend they care, but once they realize nothing serious happened, they'll drop it. Trust me. Sabrina's shoulders relaxed a little at the confidence in his voice. Jonathan had always been persuasive, calm, composed, able to say things with enough certainty that people believed him even when they shouldn't. What Sabrina didn't realize was that Jonathan wasn't just reassuring her, he was reassuring himself too. Deep down, a sliver of unease tugged at him, but he pushed it aside. He had spent years believing his influence, his money, and his targeted charm could get him out of any unfavorable situation. In his mind, this would be no different. A pair of nurses passed by, speaking quietly to each other while reviewing a chart. One of them glanced at Jonathan and Sabrina briefly before turning away. Jonathan caught the look and frowned. I don't like the way they re-staring. They're just nosy, Sabrina insisted. Medical people love drama. They probably think we re the villains in some TV episode. She laughed softly at the idea, but the sound lacked real amusement. Jonathan leaned back again. Well, let them talk. It won't matter. But the longer he sat there, the more he sensed a shift in the atmosphere. Staff members moved with a certain purpose. Nurses walked quickly, whispering to each other as they updated charts. A security officer appeared near the hallway entrance and stood watch, checking badges more attentively than before. Jonathan noticed all of it but refused to connect the dots. Admitting concern meant admitting the situation was slipping out of his control, and he wasn't ready to face that. Meanwhile, Sabrina pulled out her compact mirror and reapplied lipstick, glancing at her reflection with a self-satisfied smile. You know, she said casually, when this is over, we should talk about your divorce. Jonathan didn't react at first, but she continued anyway. I'm not saying you need to rush. But you've been miserable with her for months. You deserve better. Jonathan rubbed his temple. We'll deal with that later. Right now, I just want this hospital nonsense over with. His tone lacked the enthusiasm Sabrina expected. She ignored it, leaning closer to him. What's wrong? You reacting weird? I'm not acting weird, he snapped, then softened his tone when she pulled back. I'm just tired. You know how hospitals get under my skin. It wasn't true, but it was easier than admitting a flicker of doubt had crept in. Sabrina, satisfied enough with the explanation, relaxed again. Minutes later, Jonathan spotted a man in a dark suit stepping off the elevator. The man's posture was sharp, his movements controlled, his eyes sweeping the hallway with purpose. Jonathan didn't know who he was, but something about him triggered a faint sense of discomfort. The man looked like someone who was here with intention. He watched as the man approached the nurses' station and spoke to them with a level of authority Jonathan wasn't used to encountering from visitors. One of the nurses nodded and gestured toward the special observation unit. The man inclined his head and walked past with certainty. Sabrina followed Jonathan's gaze. Who's that? A doctor? Jonathan frowned. No, not a doctor. He sat up straighter, sensing something unfamiliar. He didn't like it. If he's here to see Emily, Sabrina said quietly, maybe he'll tell them not to overact. Jonathan didn't respond. Something was shifting, and he felt it. The casual arrogance he had leaned on for months, maybe years, didn't seem quite as solid now. A few minutes later, he overheard a nurse whisper, "That's her father." The words hit Jonathan harder than he expected. Emily's father. William Hart. A man he had only met twice, both times while trying far too hard to impress him and failing miserably. Jonathan's mouth went dry. He didn't turn towards Sabrina. He couldn't. Because now the unease he had been ignoring all afternoon grew into something heavy, something real, something he could no longer brush aside. Sabrina, oblivious, continued scrolling through her phone. Do you think they'll let us back in soon? Jonathan rubbed his jaw, his earlier confidence cracking. He didn't know how to answer. For the first time since the incident, he felt the faint grip of panic tightening around his ribs. And then he heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, and filled with unmistakable intent. William Hart stepped into the waiting area. Jonathan froze. Sabrina's smile faltered. And the illusion of control they had wrapped themselves in finally began to crumble. The moment William Hart stepped into the waiting area, the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. His presence carried the same weight it had in courtrooms, controlled, intense, and impossible to ignore. Jonathan felt his stomach twist as William's eyes locked onto him, cold and assessing. The gaze of a man who had already judged and sentenced him before a single word was spoken. Sabrina shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her confidence evaporating as William approached. She nudged Jonathan's arm lightly, as if prompting him to stand, to greet the man who had just walked in. But Jonathan stayed seated for a beat too long, thrown off balance by the sheer force of William's demeanor. William stopped directly in front of them, his posture rigid, his jaw tight. He didn't offer a greeting, didn't extend a hand, didn't pretend at politeness. He simply stared down at Jonathan as though he were examining a stain that needed to be removed. Jonathan finally pushed himself to his feet. "Mr. Hart," he began, trying to muster the charm that had worked for him many times before. "It's good to see you, Emily." "She's stable," William interrupted sharply. "Not because of anything you did." Sabrina's lips parted, but Jonathan shot her a warning glance, silently begging her not to speak. William's eyes flicked toward her anyway, dismissing her with a brief, slicing look before returning to Jonathan. "Explain to me," William said, voice low but razor-edged, "how my pregnant daughter ended up with a handprint across her face." Jonathan swallowed. He had expected anger, but not this level of precision. "It's not what it looks like. It looks," William cut in, "like she was assaulted. In a hospital room, while carrying your child." He stepped closer, his height suddenly imposing, "and you stood there, watching." Jonathan's throat tightened. His usual defenses, charm, excuses, bravado crumbled under the direct pressure of William's stare. "She started getting emotional," he said weakly. "You know how she gets." Sabrina didn't mean. William held up a hand. The gesture was small, but it stopped Jonathan instantly, as though an invisible barrier had slammed into place. "I am not interested in your interpretation of Emily's emotions. I'm interested in facts." Jonathan tried again, voice faltering. "It was a misunderstanding. Sabrina didn't intend." "Your mistress struck my daughter," William snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. "And you did nothing but smirk." The memory hit Jonathan with the force of a blow, because William was right. He had smirked. Not out of malice, but out of misguided superiority, arrogance, something he couldn't even justify to himself now. Sabrina stepped forward, trying to regain control of the narrative. "Mr. Hart, with all due respect, Emily was being extremely difficult. She's been manipulating Jonathan for months, and you can't blame me for defending myself." Pregnant women get dramatic. The words had barely left her mouth before William turned his full attention on her. "You assaulted a pregnant woman," he said, his tone dropping even deeper. "In a medical facility, in front of witnesses. And you just admitted it." Sabrina's face drained of color. "I didn't mean." "Intent," William said, cutting her off, "doesn't erase consequences. Something you clearly don't understand." Jonathan stepped between them, his panic finally showing. "Mr. Hart, please, we didn't come here to cause trouble. We just wanted to check on Emily." William raised an eyebrow. "Is that what you call it? Because according to the nurses, you caused enough distress to send her into acute fetal stress." Jonathan flinched, the words hitting harder than any accusation thus far. "We didn't know she'd react like that." "You don't know anything," William said. "Not about her, not about the baby, and certainly not about the gravity of what you've done." He took a controlled breath, his anger held with iron discipline. "The hospital has already documented her injuries. They've preserved security footage. They have statements from every nurse who responded to the emergency call." Jonathan's eyes widened. "Security footage?" "Yes," William nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. "Footage of you entering her room, footage of you leaving, footage of her condition when staff arrived, all time-stamped, all protected, all evidence." Sabrina stumbled a step back. "You can't seriously think." "Oh, I do," William replied, voice sharp as a blade. "And so will law enforcement when they arrive." Jonathan's breath caught. "You called the police?" "No," William said. The hospital did. He held Jonathan's gaze, unblinking, and I fully support their decision. Jonathan turned away, pacing a short distance before running a hand through his hair. His mask of composure was completely gone now. This is getting out of hand, he muttered. We didn't do anything that's serious. William's expression hardened, his patience thinning. You stood by while another woman attacked your pregnant wife. Then you left her alone in pain. That's not an accident. That's not an oversight. That is negligence, cruelty, and cowardice. Sabrina's voice cracked as she attempted a final defense. Emily provoked me. She was being impossible. William's gaze snapped toward her. My daughter was lying in a hospital bed, vulnerable, exhausted, carrying a child. If you felt threatened by her, that says more about your character than anything she said. Sabrina looked to Jonathan for support, but he didn't meet her eyes. Fear had fully settled into him now, fear of exposure, fear of legal consequences. Fear of the truth being laid out so clearly that even he couldn't twist it into something manageable. William stepped closer to Jonathan, voice dropping into a controlled, lethal register. I want you to understand something clearly. Whatever story you plan to spin ends today. Whatever excuses you thought would protect you won't. Emily will not be gaslit. She will not be blamed. She will not be hurt again. Jonathan's breath quickened. What do you want from me? William straightened to his full height. Stay away from her, and prepare yourself for the consequences of your actions. Neither Jonathan nor Sabrina spoke. They didn't move, they didn't protest. They only watched as William turned and walked away, not rushing, not glancing back, but with the unwavering certainty of a man who had already set justice in motion. They had underestimated the situation. They had underestimated Emily. But most of all, they had underestimated her father. Detective Marcus Hill stepped out of the elevator with a practiced calm that came from years working violent crimes for the Seattle Police Department. His badge hung at his belt, his notebook in hand, and his eyes immediately scanned the hallway with the sharp focus of someone used to piecing together truths from fragments. Beside him walked Detective Alicia Monroe, her stride equally steady, her expression cool and alert. They had been dispatched the moment St. Grace Medical Center reported an assault involving a pregnant patient. In Washington state, that automatically elevated the case to a serious offense, especially inside a hospital. A nurse at the floor desk straightened as the detectives approached. You must be here about the incident with Mrs. Emily Hart. Marcus nodded. We were told the patient is stable. We'll need access to the footage and initial medical documentation. The nurse gestured toward the special observation unit. Nurse Karen Mitchell has everything ready. She was the first responder. Marcus thanked her and proceeded down the hallway. The scent of antiseptic and the soft beeping of monitors filled the air, but beneath the sterile environment was a palpable tension. Staff members moved quickly, exchanging glances as the detectives passed, nothing overt, but enough to confirm the seriousness of what had happened. Karen stepped out of Emily's room at the perfect moment, tablet in hand. She recognized the detectives instantly. Detective Hill. Detective Monroe, that's us, Alicia said. Thanks for meeting us. We understand you were first on scene. Karen nodded. I was. I've already documented everything I observed and preserved the footage. Marcus's brows lifted slightly in approval. Good. We'll need your detailed statement, and we'll review that footage today. He glanced through the small window of Emily's room, seeing her resting while her father stood near the foot of the bed. How's the patient? Karen lowered her voice. Shaken, exhausted, but stable. The baby is stable too, but the stress reaction was strong. Marcus took notes. Let's start with your witness account. Karen walked them to the nurse's station and replayed the moment she entered Emily's room. She described the injury, Emily's condition, and the behavior of the two individuals present. Alicia listened with intense focus. Did either of them attempt to help her? No, Karen answered. Jonathan stood back with his arms crossed. Sabrina was close to the bedside and appeared agitated. When confronted, they downplayed everything. Marcus wrote quickly, and you saw clear signs of physical impact. Yes, fresh swelling, redness, distress. The fetal heart rate escalated immediately. Alicia glanced at the hallway leading toward the waiting area. And they're still here. Karen nodded reluctantly. Last I checked, yes. Emily's father confronted them earlier. Marcus and Alicia exchanged a look, one that said they both expected this case to get messy. William Hart stepped toward the detectives just as they finished speaking with Karen. His posture was commanding, his expression cold and composed. "You must be the officers responding," he said. Marcus nodded. "We are. I'm Detective Hill, this is Detective Monroe, and you are?" "William Hart," he answered firmly, "Emily Hart's father." The detectives recognized the name instantly. Even if they hadn't known his reputation as a formidable attorney, his presence alone made it clear he wasn't someone easily dismissed. "We appreciate you calling the incident in," Alicia said. William's eyes hardened. "I didn't call it in. The hospital did." "Which tells you everything you need to know about the severity." Marcus gestured toward the hallway. "We were going to interview the suspects now. If you choose to remain on the floor, please keep some distance." "I have no intention of interfering with your job," William replied. "But I expect this to be handled thoroughly." Marcus offered a reassuring nod before motioning Alicia toward the waiting room. They found Jonathan and Sabrina sitting stiffly, their earlier arrogance noticeably cracked. Sabrina immediately straightened, attempting to regain composure. Jonathan cleared his throat and forced a smile. "Officers, we were just waiting for an update on my wife." Marcus didn't sit, he didn't smile, he simply opened his notebook. "Jonathan Reese, Sabrina Lane." "Yes," they both answered, though Sabrina's voice trembled slightly. "We reinvestigating an assault reported by the hospital," Alicia said, her tone professional but unyielding. "We will need your statements." Jonathan's attempt at casual confidence faltered. "Assault, that's a strong word. It was just a misunderstanding." Marcus met his gaze with a flat, unreadable stare. "A pregnant woman was injured. That makes it our priority." Sabrina's breath hitched. "Emily exaggerated everything," she insisted. "She was being impossible, and you hit her," Alicia finished. Sabrina swallowed. "I didn't mean." Marcus stepped forward. "Intent isn't the question. The action is. The medical team verified a physical injury. We also have video showing when you entered and exited the room." Jonathan paled. He had hoped the hospital wouldn't take things that far. "Look," he said, desperate now. "Emily was emotional. She's been all over the place lately." Sabrina was defending herself. Alicia's eyebrows lifted. "Defending yourself from a bedridden pregnant woman?" Sabrina opened her mouth, then slowly closed it, realizing how weak the argument sounded spoken aloud. Marcus flipped a page in his notebook. "We will be taking your statements formally. But first, let me be clear. Assaulting a pregnant woman in this state is classified as a criminal offense. And doing it in a medical setting makes it even more serious." Sabrina's face drained of color. Jonathan's jaw clenched tightly. Alicia continued, "We've already spoken to hospital staff. We have multiple witnesses who encountered the victim immediately after the incident. Their statements support the report." Sabrina looked to Jonathan for help, panic rising in her eyes. Tell them it wasn't that bad." Jonathan's lips parted, but no excuse surfaced that didn't sound absurd or incriminating. Marcus snapped his notebook shut. "You two will be separated for questioning. Don't leave the building." Sabrina blurted, "Are we arrested?" "Not yet," Alicia said. "But don't give us a reason to change that." The detectives stepped away, leaving Jonathan and Sabrina gripping the edges of their seats. Their earlier confidence had evaporated completely. Outside the waiting room, Marcus sighed. "This case is going to get bigger before it gets smaller." Alicia nodded. "Especially with William Hart involved, and the evidence is solid, very solid." As they walked back toward Emily's room to request her statement when she felt ready, William stood near the door with his arms crossed protectively. He didn't speak, but the look in his eyes made something clear. Whatever came next, he was prepared to see it through to the end. Meanwhile, Jonathan finally dropped his head into his shaking hands. Sabrina curled in on herself, whispering frantic sentences he didn't respond to. For the first time, they both understood. This wasn't going away. The detectives weren't going away. And William Hart definitely wasn't going away. Detective Marcus Hill returned to the waiting area with a firm, precise stride. He didn't need to raise his voice or use dramatic gestures. His posture alone made it clear that the situation had escalated. Jonathan and Sabrina both stood abruptly when he approached, their expressions anxious and strained. Marcus positioned himself in front of them with Alicia Monroe at his side. "We have enough preliminary evidence to proceed," he announced. "Ms. Lane, you are being detained for questioning regarding the assault of a pregnant woman. Ms. Reese, you are being held for potential complicity and failure to intervene." Sabrina gasped, hand flying to her chest. "Detained? Are you kidding me? I barely." Alicia held up a hand. Keep your hands where we can see them, Ms. Lane. You are not under arrest at this moment, but you are being detained as part of an active investigation. Please cooperate. Jonathan reached for Sabrina's arm as if to steady her, but Marcus shot him a warning glare. Don't interfere. I'm not interfering, Jonathan stammered, though his voice was thin. I'm just trying to understand why this is happening. We didn't hurt anyone. Marcus's brow arched. Your wife is in the Special Observation Unit. She has documented bruising. She suffered a stress reaction severe enough to endanger her child. And you think this doesn't count as hurting someone? Jonathan opened his mouth again, but nothing came out. Alicia spoke next, her tone steady. Mr. Reese, we reviewed the hallway footage. Both of you were in that room. Your wife was in distress immediately after you left. The medical team's statements corroborate the timeline. Sabrina shook her head vigorously. But you didn't see what happened inside the room. Emily was provoking me. She said horrible things. Words don't justify physical assault, Alicia said sharply, and the medical report is consistent with a strike. The angle, the pattern, the reddening, the swelling. Sabrina's face flushed with panic. I didn't mean to hit her that hard. Marcus exchanged a look with Alicia. Thank you for confirming physical contact, he said. That will be added to your statement. Sabrina slapped her hands over her mouth, realizing too late what she had admitted. Jonathan grabbed her arm. Stop talking. His voice trembled now. His confidence was gone, replaced with something rawer fear. But Marcus wasn't finished. We also have the incident time stamped to the exact minute. The fetal monitor alarm was triggered at 5:14 p.m. and staff were inside the room by 5:16 p.m. Your exit from the room was recorded at 5:15 p.m. Everything lines up. Jonathan's composure finally cracked. He lifted a hand to his forehead, rubbing aggressively as if trying to think his way out. This is blown out of proportion. Emily is dramatic. She always has been. She knows how to make things look worse. Marcus stepped closer. A vulnerable pregnant woman does not have to convince anyone. The evidence speaks for itself. Jonathan blinked rapidly, eyes darting as if searching for an escape hatch. But there wasn't one, not this time. Sabrina pointed at Jonathan. This is your fault. You said it wouldn't be a big deal.
You said nobody would care.
Jonathan glared at her.
You hit her.
You watched. Sabrina fired back. You stood there like it was entertainment. Alicia interjected, her voice cutting through their bickering. Enough, both of you. If you continue talking over each other, you're only making things worse. Sabrina's chest heaved with panic. Jonathan's hands shook. The polished floor beneath them felt like a courtroom to both of them now. With two detectives acting as judges they could not charm or manipulate. Marcus gestured toward the hallway. Ms. Lane, you'll come with me to interview room B. Mr. Reese, Detective Monroe will take you to room A. You will remain separated. Sabrina started to panic. Separate? No, Jonathan. Jonathan reached toward her instinctively, but Marcus stepped between them. Move, he ordered, not unkindly but firmly. Sabrina hesitated, but a uniformed officer appeared at Marcus's signal. She finally allowed herself to be led down the hallway, her breath coming in quick, sharp bursts. Jonathan watched her go, his face pale. He turned to Alicia. Look, I didn't do anything wrong. I'm not the one who hit her. Alicia's expression didn't change. You were present. You stood by while your wife was attacked. Under Washington law, that can classify as aiding, abetting, contributing to the harm, or failing to protect a vulnerable person. All of which make you liable. Jonathan opened his mouth, ready to protest again, but Alicia added, we also have your reaction documented by the nurse. She described you as dismissive and indifferent. That will be included in the report. Jonathan's knees nearly gave out. Indifferent doesn't mean guilty. It means negligent, Alicia corrected. And when a pregnant patient is involved, negligence becomes a serious crime. Meanwhile, down the hall, Sabrina was already in a state close to unraveling. The uniformed officer guided her into an empty interview room. She looked around wildly, as if expecting Jonathan to appear. When she realized she was truly alone, she began pacing, muttering to herself, this is insane. This is all her fault. Emily's the one who destroyed everything. Why am I the one in trouble? Marcus entered the room a few seconds later, closing the door behind him with a calm, controlled click. Sabrina froze. He took a seat across from her, opened his notebook, and gestured toward the chair opposite. Sit. She sat reluctantly, hands trembling. I didn't mean to hurt her, she blurted. She said awful things and... Marcus raised a hand. Before you continue, I need to advise you of your rights. You are not under arrest yet, but you are being questioned as part of an active criminal investigation. Anything you say may be documented. Sabrina swallowed, the gravity hitting her. Marcus began. Tell me exactly what happened in the room. Meanwhile, in interview room, Alicia sat across from Jonathan. She placed a recorder on the table. For the record, please state your full name. Jonathan hesitated before answering. Jonathan Rees. And your relationship to the victim? Alicia asked. He flinched. She's my wife. Alicia clicked her pen. Then explain why you did nothing to protect her. Jonathan closed his eyes. The weight of the question crushed whatever excuses he had tried to build. I don't know. It's a simple question, Alicia said. Why didn't you intervene? Jonathan stared at the table. Because I didn't care. The shock of the words hit him even as they left his mouth. Alicia's expression didn't change. She simply noted his statement. Hours later, both interviews were formally documented, backed by preserved footage, medical evidence, and the hospital's incident report. The detectives stepped into the hallway where William waited. Marcus spoke first. Mr. Hart, we've collected enough to proceed. Charges will be recommended to the prosecutor's office. William's expression didn't change, but his eyes reflected grim satisfaction. Good. Down the hallway, Jonathan and Sabrina sat in separate rooms alone, defeated, unraveling. The walls were closing in. The evidence was airtight. And the consequences they never believed in were finally reaching them. The courtroom of the King County Superior Court carried the heavy atmosphere of a place where lives were judged, consequences were handed down, and truth, no matter how ugly, was forced into the open. Rows of wooden benches stretched across the room, filled with reporters, spectators, hospital personnel, and a few individuals who had simply heard that a high-profile assault case involving a pregnant woman was about to unfold. The murmur of voices died gradually as the bailiff stepped forward and announced, "All rise." Judge Eleanor Price entered with the quiet authority of a woman who had seen more than enough human cruelty to be unmoved by theatrics. She settled into her seat, adjusted her glasses, and looked over the files before her. You may be seated. Jonathan and Sabrina sat side by side at the defense table, though they no longer looked united. Sabrina's hands trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap, and Jonathan stared ahead with the blank expression of a man trying desperately not to show the panic sitting heavy on his chest. Their attorney, a sharply dressed man named Russell Brenner, straightened his tie and attempted to look composed despite the storm he knew was coming. Across the aisle, William Hart sat with a protective posture, his presence calm but fierce. Emily sat beside him, her cheek still faintly bruised, though healed enough to show only a shadow of the violence she endured. Her hands rested over her belly, a subconscious gesture she had adopted since the attack. Jar. Rivers and Nurse Karen sat behind her, prepared to testify. Judge Price flipped through the opening documents and spoke with clipped efficiency. This court is convened to examine the charges brought against Sabrina Lane for assault in the second degree against a pregnant woman, and charges of complicity and reckless endangerment against Jonathan Rees. We will review evidence, hear testimony from relevant parties, and determine whether the prosecution has met its burden. Jonathan swallowed hard. Sabrina's shoulders tensed further. Russell leaned over and whispered something to them, likely a reminder to stay quiet and composed. But no amount of whispered reassurance could hold back the wave that was about to hit them. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Melissa Grant, stood confidently at her table. She organized her notes, scanned the room once, then began her opening statement. Your Honor, the evidence will show that on the evening of March 12th, in Sized Grace Medical Center, the defendant, Ms. Lane, struck a pregnant woman across the face with enough force to trigger fetal distress. The victim, Mrs. Emily Hart, required emergency medical intervention. At the same time, Jonathan Rees, the victim's husband, stood by without attempting to intervene or call for help. Russell rose slightly. Objection. Counsel is presenting conclusions during opening. Sustained, Judge Price said. Stick to outlining what you intend to prove, Ms. Grant. Melissa nodded. Of course, Your Honor. We will present medical documentation, video footage from the hospital hallway, and testimony from nurses and physicians who responded to the emergency. We will also present testimony from the victim herself, who will describe the physical and emotional harm caused. She let her words hang for a moment before taking her seat. Russell stood next, smoothing his jacket. Your Honor, the defense intends to show that this was a heated argument, not an intentional assault. Ms. Lane acted reflexively under emotional distress. Mr. Rees did not intervene because the situation escalated too quickly for him to react. They did not intend harm. Judge Price listened without expression and nodded for the prosecution to begin. Melissa approached the evidence cart and held up a sealed folder. Your Honor, the state introduces Exhibit A Seat. Grace Medical Center's incident report. The bailiff delivered the document to the judge, who reviewed the first page. Admitted. Melissa continued, Exhibit B, photographs of the victim's injury taken within minutes of the event. The photos were displayed on the courtroom screen. Emily's cheek swollen and reddened, a faint cut on her lip, her expression dazed and fearful. A murmur spread through the courtroom. The images were undeniable. Sabrina looked down, avoiding the screen. Jonathan clenched his jaw. Melissa moved on. Exhibit C, hallway security footage. The lights dimmed slightly as the screen switched to video. The footage showed Jonathan and Sabrina walking toward Emily's room. It showed them entering. The timestamp jumped forward. Then it showed them leaving, Sabrina's posture stiff, Jonathan smirking faintly. Emily's distress audible in the background as nurses rushed past them toward the room. When the video ended, the courtroom was thick with tension. Judge Price leaned back and folded her hands. Proceed. Melissa called her first witness, Nurse Karen Mitchell. Karen walked to the stand with steady confidence, placed her hand on the Bible, and took the oath. She sat, maintaining the calm professionalism she had held since the incident. Ms. Mitchell, Melissa began, you were the nurse who responded to the victim's distress call. Can you describe what you found? Karen nodded. Mrs. Hart was in physical and emotional distress. She had fresh swelling on her left cheek, redness consistent with impact, and her fetal monitor showed elevated heart rate patterns indicating fetal stress. Did she say anything about what happened? She didn't need to, Karen replied. Her condition and the presence of the two individuals in the room were enough to indicate a disturbance. Melissa continued, did the defendants attempt to help the victim in any way? Karen's brow tightened. No, they did nothing. They left the room immediately after she was struck. Russell rose again. Objection. This suggests Ms. Mitchell witnessed the incident. Karen turned to him, eyes steady. I witnessed the aftermath, and that was enough. Judge Price motioned Melissa to continue. Juter Rivers was called next. He testified with clinical precision, explaining how stress can endanger a pregnancy, how the fetal monitor reading spiked, and how Emily required extended monitoring to ensure the baby wasn't harmed. Jonathan shifted, rubbing his hands together, but he didn't speak. Finally, Melissa approached the victim's stand. The prosecution calls Emily Hart. Emily stood slowly. William helped her steady herself before she reached the witness box. She took the oath and sat, her eyes briefly flicking toward Jonathan and Sabrina, not with hatred, but with something far colder, recognition of who they truly were. Mrs. Hart, Melissa said softly, can you tell us what happened in your own words? Emily took a breath. I was in the hospital for monitoring. I didn't expect anyone to show up, but Jonathan came in, and Sabrina was with him. Her voice wavered but held firm. She started saying cruel things. She said I was manipulative, that I didn't deserve to be a mother. And then she slapped me. Sabrina flinched. Emily continued, I couldn't even catch my breath. The baby reacted immediately. I could feel it hurt. Everything hurt. And what did your husband do? Melissa asked. Emily's eyes filled with a quiet ache. Nothing. He watched. A wave of shock washed across the courtroom. Russell stood, preparing to cross-examine, but the judge held up a hand. That will come after recess. Court will break for 30 minutes. The gavel struck. Jonathan exhaled shakily, his composure shattered. Sabrina stared ahead as though the world had tilted beneath her feet. Across the aisle, William placed a hand on Emily's back, steadying her as they rose. The courtroom was no longer just a stage. It was the place where everything Jonathan and Sabrina once controlled slipped away, and where accountability finally took hold. When the courtroom reconvened after recess, the atmosphere had transformed. The earlier buzz of speculation had faded into something heavier, more focused. Everyone in the gallery seemed to understand that the next portion of the hearing would determine the outcome of months of pain, investigation, and emotional turmoil. Judge Eleanor Price returned to the bench with a calm yet impenetrable expression. She adjusted her glasses, glanced at the notes before her, and then looked out over the room. We will proceed, she said. Emily sat with her father at her side, hands folded protectively over her stomach. William kept one hand near hers, steady and reassuring, while his eyes never left the bench. Across the aisle, Jonathan's complexion had turned a pale shade of gray. He kept tugging at his collar as if it were suddenly too tight. Sabrina, sitting rigidly beside him, tapped her foot nervously, the bravado she once carried now nowhere to be found. Judge Price began, her tone neutral but authoritative. We have heard witness testimony from the victim, medical personnel, and the responding investigators. We have reviewed medical documentation and observed the hallway footage that recorded the defendants entering and exiting the hospital room around the time of the assault. Her gaze shifted briefly toward Jonathan and Sabrina, freezing them in place. The evidence is consistent and compelling. Russell Brenner, the defense attorney, stood. Your Honor, before you continue, the defense would like to. Judge Price raised a hand. Mr. Brenner, you will have the opportunity to speak during sentencing arguments. For now, you are to remain seated. Russell lowered himself reluctantly, lips pressed tightly together. The courtroom quieted as Judge Price continued. Ms. Lane, you have been charged with assault in the second degree against a pregnant woman, an offense that carries enhanced penalties under Washington state law due to the vulnerable condition of the victim. The medical evidence shows clear physical injury. The testimony from the victim, as well as from the first responding nurse and attending physician, corroborates the nature and timing of the strike that caused the injury. Sabrina's breath quickened. Her hands trembled violently as she grabbed the edge of the defense table. The judge shifted her attention. Mr. Rees, while you did not physically strike the victim, your role in this incident is significant. You failed to intervene when your wife was attacked. You did not attempt to assist her afterward. Your own statement indicates that you chose not to act because you didn't care. Jonathan shut his eyes in humiliation. He had replayed that sentence in his mind for hours, realizing too late how damning it sounded outside the privacy of an interview room. Your behavior constitutes reckless endangerment and willful negligence toward a vulnerable pregnant woman under your care. William watched the defendants with an unwavering stare, his jaw tight and his expression controlled. Emily sat quietly, absorbing every word with a mixture of vindication and sorrow. Judge Price clasped her hands together. We now move to sentencing recommendations. Ms. Grant. The prosecutor rose. Your Honor, given the severity of the assault and the potential risk to both mother and child, the state recommends a custodial sentence. Ms. Lane should receive no less than 3 years of incarceration. Mir. Rees should receive a lesser, but still significant consequence for negligence contributing to endangerment. The state recommends 12 months, along with mandated counseling and a restraining order protecting the victim. A wave of whispers rippled through the gallery. Sabrina stared at the prosecutor with wide, horrified eyes. Jonathan's breathing grew shallow. Russell stood quickly. Your Honor, my clients had no criminal intent. Ms. Lane acted in a moment of emotional distress, not malice. Rees made a grave mistake, yes, but negligence is not a violent crime. We ask for leniency, probation, community service, counseling. My clients have no criminal record. A prison sentence would destroy their futures. Judge Price listened without interruption. When he finished, she fixed him with a steady gaze. Mir. Brenner, emotional instability does not excuse violence. And failing to act in a situation involving harm to a pregnant woman is not a mistake. It is a serious breach of responsibility. Sabrina covered her face, tears forming. Jonathan's hands shook uncontrollably as he gripped the table. Judge Price straightened. The room fell still. It is the decision of this court that Ms. Sabrina Lane be sentenced to 3 years in a state correctional facility. She will also undergo mandatory anger management counseling. A restraining order will be issued, prohibiting her from approaching Mrs. Hart for a minimum of 5 years. Sabrina gasped. No, please, Your Honor, I didn't. She turned frantically to Jonathan. Do something. Jonathan looked at her helplessly. He had nothing left to offer. Judge Price turned next to him. Jonathan Rees, the court sentences you to 1 year in county detention, followed by 6 months of supervised probation. You will complete a counseling program addressing emotional neglect and abusive relational behavior. A restraining order identical to Ms. Lane's will apply to you. Jonathan collapsed back in his chair, staring blankly at the floor. Judge Price continued, undisturbed by their reactions. Both defendants will be responsible for court costs and restitution for medical expenses incurred by the victim. A reporter in the gallery scribbled notes rapidly. Another whispered into her phone, already drafting the breaking news headline. Cameras were not allowed inside the courtroom, but the world outside would soon know everything that had taken place within these walls. Judge Price gave the gavel a final, decisive strike. Court is adjourned. The bailiff moved immediately towards Sabrina. "Ms. Lane, please stand." She shook her head violently, tears streaming as she clung to the table. No, this can't be happening. But the bailiff was unyielding. He gently but firmly guided her to her feet and began escorting her toward the exit, her sobs echoing in the courtroom. Jonathan didn't resist when two deputies approached him. He looked numb, hollowed out, as they placed handcuffs around his wrists. He glanced toward Emily only once, a fleeting look filled with regret, fear, and something resembling realization. But Emily didn't look back. She kept her gaze forward, her hand resting protectively on her belly. As the defendants were escorted out, William stepped forward and placed a steadying arm around his daughter. "It's done," he said softly. "It's finally done." Emily released a breath she had been holding for months. Not relief, not joy, something deeper. Something like closure. The courtroom emptied slowly, but the weight of the moment lingered. Justice had been delivered, not loudly or dramatically, but decisively. The truth had been exposed, the system had done its job. And as Emily walked out of the courtroom beside her father, she felt for the first time since the attack that the path ahead was hers to shape. Free from the two people who had nearly destroyed her life. The weeks following the courtroom verdict moved in a calmer rhythm, nothing like the chaos that had consumed Emily's life for so long. For the first time in months, she felt her days unfolding with gentle predictability. There were no more sudden door slams, no harsh accusations, no cold detachment lingering in her home. Those things had belonged to another life, a darker one that she had finally stepped away from. The bruise on her cheek faded slowly, leaving only a faint shadow that reminded her of how close she'd come to losing everything. Her father insisted she stay with him temporarily, and though Emily initially hesitated, the quiet comfort of his home became exactly the refuge she needed. William's house, nestled in a peaceful Seattle neighborhood lined with maple trees, felt worlds away from the turmoil she'd endured. The windows let in soft morning light, the rooms carried the faint scent of cedar, and the furnishings were warm without being heavy pieces her mother had once chosen with care. Her father approached her healing with the same intensity he applied to legal strategy. He scheduled her follow-up appointments, ensured she took every medication on time, and stocked the kitchen with groceries he thought she might enjoy. But his care came without smothering. He allowed her space, encouraged her to speak only when she felt ready, and never pressured her to relive what she'd gone through. Every evening he brought her tea, sat nearby with a book or case file, and simply kept her company. It was a quiet reassurance, one Emily needed more than she ever realized. As the days passed, she began reclaiming small pieces of herself. She woke to soft music rather than tension. She cooked meals again. She took walks around the neighborhood, breathing in the crisp spring air and feeling her body grow stronger. And with every day that passed, her baby's movements became more distinct. The tiny kicks were constant reminders that life was growing inside her, new, hopeful, promising. The baby became her anchor in a way she hadn't expected. Each flutter and nudge brought a swell of emotion that balanced both awe and determination. She promised herself, again and again, that the child she carried would never know the pain she endured. That her son or daughter would grow up in a home filled with stability, compassion, and safety, the very things she had been denied in her marriage. The community around her rallied too. Neighbors dropped off casseroles, baby blankets, and handwritten notes wishing her strength. Her closest friends visited gently, treating her healing with the tenderness it required. Her doctor checked the baby frequently, reassuring her during every appointment that the little one was thriving. Even Nurse Karen visited once. She stood in the doorway with a warm smile when Emily opened it. "I just wanted to see how you were doing," she said, hands folded modestly. Emily invited her in, and the conversation flowed more naturally than she expected. Karen told her how proud she was of Emily's courage, how relieved she was to see her healing, and how much strength she had shown during the ordeal. When Karen left, Emily felt a deep gratitude to the nurse who had stepped between her and danger without hesitation. As her due date approached, Emily began focusing on preparing a nursery. She and her father chose a soft sage green color for the walls. William assembled the crib himself, muttering under his breath when the instructions didn't make sense. Emily laughed for the first time in months, watching her father struggle with the final screw before triumphantly snapping the frame into place. They decorated with gentle woodland themes, tiny foxes, bears and owls dotting the walls and blankets. The room felt peaceful, the kind of place where a child could sleep safely. One afternoon, Emily sat in the rocking chair near the window, resting her hands over her belly as sunlight streamed across her lap. She felt the baby move and smiled softly. Her life was far from perfect, but she wasn't broken, and she wasn't afraid anymore. Her divorce proceedings moved forward quickly. Because Jonathan faced criminal charges, financial negotiations were clean cut. Emily received everything she needed: financial stability, medical coverage, and a court-ordered restraining order that prohibited Jonathan and Sabrina from approaching her for years. The judge granted full custody of the unborn child, noting Jonathan's failure to protect the baby as part of the ruling. When Emily received the paperwork finalizing the divorce, she let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. It was over, completely over. On the day she signed the final document, William took her hand gently. "You fought your way through a storm most people never see," he told her, "and you came out stronger." She leaned her head against his shoulder, grateful for his unwavering presence. "I couldn't have done it without you," she whispered. William shook his head. "You could have. But I'm glad I was there." When her labor finally began, it was a brisk, rainy morning in early summer. William drove her to St. Grace Medical Center, his hand steady on the steering wheel despite the tightness in his voice. The same hospital where everything had fallen apart was now the place where everything would begin again. This time the staff greeted her with warm smiles. Karen was not on shift, but several nurses recognized Emily and helped her settle in with exceptional care. Labor was long but manageable, and Emily focused on every breath, every contraction, every sign of progress. William stayed with her the entire time, holding her hand, whispering encouragement, telling her she was doing beautifully. And then, finally, her baby arrived, a healthy, rosy-cheeked newborn with bright eyes and a strong cry. When the doctor placed the baby on her chest, Emily felt a wave of emotion so powerful she couldn't speak. She cradled the tiny form gently, tears falling freely as she whispered, "You're safe now. I've got you." William stood nearby, blinking hard, his expression softening in a way Emily had rarely seen. "Welcome to the world, little one," he murmured. "You're in good hands." The room filled with warmth, with purpose, with the kind of joy that rewrites the heart. Days later, Emily walked through her father's front door carrying her newborn in her arms. The world outside felt fresh, full of possibility. She had survived betrayal, violence, and fear. She had walked through the fire and come out stronger. Now, she wasn't just recovering, she was beginning anew. And as she rocked her baby to sleep in the sage green nursery, Emily realized that her story wasn't defined by what had been done to her. It was defined by how she rose, how she protected her child, how she reclaimed her life. The past was behind her, but the future, full of hope, full of promise, was entirely her own. This story carries more than a sequence of dramatic events. It holds a powerful reminder of how fragile, yet resilient, human lives can be. At its heart, it teaches us that the people we trust most can sometimes become the very ones who wound us the deepest. Emily's journey reveals a painful truth many fail to acknowledge: emotional neglect can be just as damaging as physical violence. Jonathan didn't lay a hand on her, but the moment he turned away from her pain, he betrayed every promise a husband makes. His indifference was a quiet cruelty, a form of abandonment disguised as composure. The story teaches that love without responsibility, empathy, or courage is not love at all. It's cowardice wearing the mask of familiarity. Sabrina's role in Emily's suffering highlights another critical lesson: rage that goes unchecked grows into recklessness, and recklessness turns into harm. Jealousy blinded her judgment to the point where she believed she had the right to hurt a vulnerable woman who had never wronged her directly. Her downfall shows that insecurity mixed with entitlement becomes a dangerous combination. The way she tried to justify her actions, blaming hormones, emotions, or imagined provocations, reflects a broader issue in society: People often excuse their worst behavior instead of taking responsibility for it. But responsibility always arrives, whether we welcome it or not. Sabrina learned it the hard way, when the legal system held her accountable for the violence she tried to minimize. The hospital staff, especially Nurse Karen, embody the importance of intervention. Her quick response, meticulous documentation, and refusal to be intimidated by Jonathan or Sabrina demonstrate the impact one person can make when they choose integrity over convenience. Many people witness wrongdoing but hesitate to act out of fear, discomfort, or the belief that it's not my problem. Karen's courage shows the opposite, as stepping in can save a life, protect the vulnerable, and prevent harm from spiraling further. Her actions prove that doing the right thing doesn't always require grand gestures. Sometimes it's simply refusing to ignore the truth. She became the kind of guardian every patient deserves, especially those too overwhelmed or frightened to defend themselves. William Hart's unwavering support serves as another central lesson. Family can be a powerful source of strength when everything else collapses. Emily's father did not respond with empty comfort or emotional outbursts. He responded with action, discipline, and fierce protection. He understood that healing isn't just about soothing wounds, it's about ensuring the people who caused them are held accountable. His calm yet relentless pursuit of justice shows the value of standing firm when someone you love cannot stand for themselves. William reminds us that being present in someone's darkest moment doesn't require dramatic speeches. It requires reliability, wisdom, and the willingness to confront hard truths head on. Emily's own arc offers the most profound lesson. She teaches us that trauma does not have the final say in someone's story. She endured betrayal, humiliation, physical pain, and emotional devastation, yet she still found the strength to rebuild. She left behind a marriage that was breaking her spirit, even though doing so meant facing a frightening future alone. She allowed herself to be vulnerable again in the hospital bed, in the courtroom, and ultimately in her journey toward motherhood. Emily shows that healing isn't linear. It isn't neat. But it is possible when surrounded by people who care, when one chooses courage over fear, and when the truth is no longer denied but confronted. The courtroom scene reinforces the core belief that justice matters not just in the legal sense, but also in the human sense. When the judge laid out the consequences for Jonathan and Sabrina, she didn't do it to punish blindly. She did it to uphold the principle that actions, especially those that cause harm, must be faced honestly. The law served as a mirror, reflecting their choices without distortion. It teaches us that consequences exist for a reason, to protect the innocent and prevent the dangerous from repeating their behavior. Justice may not erase trauma, but it creates space for healing and closure. One of the quieter lessons lies in how the community and medical team supported Emily. Healing is rarely achieved alone. Strength grows from the presence of others, those who show up, who listen, who defend, who encourage. The story reminds readers that compassion is a collective effort. A support system, whether family or friends or strangers in uniforms, plays a vital role in lifting someone from the aftermath of violence toward a safer future. The final chapters reinforce the idea that hope can grow from devastation. Emily's new life with her child symbolizes renewal. The nursery she creates with her father's help represents more than preparation, it represents rebirth. It signals a shift in her life's direction, guided not by fear but by the determination to create something healthier and more beautiful. Her baby becomes a symbol of possibility, a testament that even after pain, life continues, and joy can still take root. Ultimately, the story's greatest lesson is this: you cannot always choose what happens to you, but you can choose who you become after it. Emily becomes stronger, Jonathan faces the consequences of his indifference, Sabrina confronts the truth of her actions, and William proves that loyalty and love can be unshakable forces. Every character reveals something about human nature, its flaws, its courage, its capacity for destruction, and its potential for resilience. The message is clear and enduring. Abuse, whether physical, emotional, or passive, is never acceptable. Turning a blind eye is its own form of violence. And healing begins the moment someone stands up, acknowledges the truth, and refuses to let wrongdoing define the rest of their life. Emily's journey shows that even after the darkest moments, new beginnings are possible, and strength can be rebuilt, one heartbeat at a time. If you find this video helpful, don't forget to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss upcoming videos. If you have any suggestions or questions, feel free to leave a comment below. I'd really love to hear your feedback. Thank you for watching until the end.